"Do you recognize me?" said the beautiful bride to the rancher. "I was your childhood friend." The dusty stagecoach halts. The church bell tolls, and a veiled bride steps down into the street. The rancher stares, his heart stops. The woman before him is no stranger. She is the little girl he once defended long ago, but now she's dressed for another man. The town cheers her wedding, yet whispers stir. The banker she's promised to hides a secret more. Dangerous than a drawn gun, her family holds the water rights to every drop this land depends on. And now her choice could cost her brother's freedom and her own, as jail keys rattle and hoofbeats thunder. The rancher faces the truth. Love, justice, and survival are on the line. Will he risk everything to save the bride who carries his past and perhaps his future, or will the town's greed tear them apart forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Callius Harding's ranch as he worked steadily at mending the broken corral fence. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, driving each nail home with precise strikes. The familiar rhythm of the work couldn't quite drown out the hollow ache that had been his constant companion these past 3 years. Since Sarah's passing, the creak of leather and soft thud of hooves drew his attention. Tom Wheeler, his nearest neighbor, rode up on his bay mare, reining in beside the fence line. "Afternoon, Elias," Tom called out, pushing his hat back. "Reckon you'll be heading into town." Whole place is stirred up like an anthill banker. Morrison's bride-to-be arrives on today's stage. Elias wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Hadn't planned on it. Might do you good to get out some," Tom suggested gently. "Sarah wouldn't want you spending all your days out here, alone." The mention of her name sent a familiar pang through Elias's chest. He turned back to his work, driving another nail with perhaps more force than necessary. But Tom's words had stirred something in him, a restlessness he couldn't quite name. After Tom rode on, Blease found himself unable to focus on the fence repair. The sun was lowering toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. With a sigh, he gathered his tools and headed toward the barn. "Might as well see what all the fuss is about," he muttered to himself, leading his horse Shadow out of his stall. The black gelding stood patient as Elias tightened the cinch and swung into the saddle. The ride into town was peaceful, disturbed only by the occasional meadowlark's evening song. Elias let his mind wander back to Sarah, her gentle laugh, the way she'd hum while working in their kitchen garden. The memories were less sharp now, worn smooth like river stones, but they still brought both comfort and pain. Main Street was indeed buzzing with activity when he arrived. Ladies in their best afternoon dresses gathered in small clusters, while men lounged against storefront posts, trying to appear casual in their curiosity. Children darted between the adults, their excitement infectious. Elias dismounted and looped Shadow's reins around the hitching post. He found a quiet spot near the general store, content to observe from the edges of the crowd. The sun had dipped lower, casting golden light across the dusty street. A shout went up from the west end of town. "Stage is coming." The crowd shifted, pressing forward as the distinctive rumble of wooden wheels and the jingle of harness grew louder. The stagecoach appeared through the settling evening light. 4 horses pulling hard as the driver guided them toward the station. Dust swirled up from the wheels as the coach came to a stop. The driver set the brake with a loud crack, and conversation hushed as everyone waited to see the mysterious bride-to-be. The door swung open, and a figure emerged, a woman in an elegant white satin traveling dress, her face obscured by a delicate veil. She moved with a grace that seemed to capture everyone's attention, but something about the way she held herself made Elias's heart skip a beat. There was a familiar quality to her movements that tugged at his memory. Instead of turning toward the cluster of town ladies waiting to welcome her, The veiled woman's head turned, scanning the crowd until she seemed to fix directly on Elias. The world around them seemed to fade as she took several steps in his direction. "Do you recognize me?" Her voice was soft but clear, carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "I was your childhood friend." Elias felt the blood drain from his face as she reached up and slowly drew back her veil. The crowd's murmuring grew as they watched this unexpected drama unfold. There, standing before him in the golden evening light, was a face he'd never thought to see again. Clara Yazzie, the half-Navajo girl he'd defended from schoolyard bullies so many years ago. Her dark eyes held the same quiet strength he remembered, though time had transformed her from the determined child he'd known into a striking woman. "Clara." His voice came out rough with disbelief. "We thought, after your family was forced to leave." The crowd's whispers grew more intense. Banker Morrison pushed his way forward, his face flushed with confusion and growing anger. "Miss Andrews, what is the meaning of this?" Clara didn't even glance his way, her eyes remaining steady on Elias's face. "I never forgot your kindness, Elias Harding. When other children called me names and pushed me down, you helped me up. When they stole my books, you shared yours." Memories flooded back, a young Clara sitting beside him under the schoolhouse's lone cottonwood tree, both of them sharing his reader. Her quick mind and quiet determination to learn, despite the cruel treatment she received. The day her family disappeared, their small homestead abandoned overnight as the authorities forced many native families from their lands. 15 years, Elias said softly. "We never knew what happened to your family." "We went north to my mother's people," Clara replied. "But I never stopped thinking about this place, about the friends I left behind, the unspoken weight of all that had happened in those years hung between them." The townsfolk had drawn closer, forming a circle around this unexpected reunion. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval. But Clara stood straight and proud, ignoring their stares. "Miss Andrews, or whoever you are, I demand an explanation." Banker Morrison's face had grown even redder. "The marriage contract ... was never signed," Clara finished firmly, finally turning to face him. "And I believe you'll find the money I wired ahead was conditional upon my approval of the arrangement." Her voice carried the same quiet dignity Elias remembered, though now it held an edge of steel that hadn't been there in childhood. The banker spluttered, but Clara had already turned back to Elias. The setting sun caught the silver pins in her dark hair, creating a halo effect that made her seem to glow. "I have much to tell you, old friend, about why I've really come back." Elias found himself unable to look away from her face. Seeing both the child she had been and the woman she'd become, the lonely years since Sarah's death seemed to shift, like shadows changing shape in the evening light. Here was someone who knew him before grief had carved its valleys into his heart. Someone who carried her own share of loss and survival. "Much obliged for remembering me," he managed to say, his voice growing stronger. "Reckon we do have some catching up to do." A small smile touched Clara's lips, warming her eyes. The same smile he remembered from their shared school days, when they'd found friendship, despite all the forces trying to keep them apart. The crowd around them continued to buzz with speculation, but in that moment it was as if they stood alone in a pool of golden evening light. Two old friends reunited by fate or providence on a dusty frontier street. Elias stepped forward instinctively, steadying Clara as she swayed slightly on her feet. The white satin of her dress rustled against the wooden sidewalk, her small hand gripping his forearm for balance. Around them, the townsfolk's whispers grew into an audible buzz. "Well, I never ... double quotes Martha Wilson's voice carried above the others, her fan fluttering rapidly against her chin. That half-breed girl from years back. Someone else muttered, not quite under their breath. Elias felt Clara stiffen at the words. but her chin remained high, dignity intact. The late afternoon sun caught the deep brown of her eyes, showing the same quiet strength he remembered from their childhood days. "It has been many years," Clara said softly, her voice carrying clearly despite its gentleness. "But I could never forget how you stood up for me in the schoolyard." Elias Harding. The crowd parted as Charles Redmond approached, his polished boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. His smile was practiced and tight, failing to reach his eyes as he surveyed the scene before him. "My dear," Charles said, extending his hand toward Clara, "you must be exhausted from your journey. Perhaps introductions would be better saved for another time." Clara straightened her shoulders, turning to face her intended. "Mr. Redmond, please allow me to explain. Elias and I grew up together in these parts, before my family was moved to the reservation. His friendship meant a great deal during difficult times." Charles's jaw tightened momentarily before he smoothed his expression. "How ... Fascinating, though surely ancient history now." He placed a proprietary hand on Clara's elbow. "Mrs. Henderson has prepared your room at the boarding house." "We shouldn't keep her waiting." "Of course," Clara replied, but her eyes found Elias's one last time. There was something in that look, a plea perhaps, or a warning that sent a chill down his spine despite the warm evening air. "Good day, Mr. Harding," Charles said curtly, already steering Clara away. The crowd slowly dispersed, breaking into small clusters of animated conversation. Elias watched them go, Clara's white dress bright against the dusty street until they disappeared into the boarding house. He mounted his horse and turned toward home, but his thoughts remained in town, tumbling over the unexpected encounter. The sun was setting by the time he reached his ranch, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. His hired hand, Jake Murphy, had already lit the lamps in the kitchen and was setting out a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and coffee. "Quite a show in town today," I hear Jake commented, passing Elias a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Word travels fast. Tom Wheeler's boy rode by earlier. It's full of news about the banker's bride making eyes at you." Elias sighed, settling into his chair. "It wasn't like that. We knew each other as children, nothing more." Jake spooned beans onto his plate, his weathered face thoughtful. "Interesting timing, though. Banka's been running his mouth lately about some big plans. Was at the saloon last night, bragging about how his marriage is going to secure him new water rights. Seems mighty sure of himself." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Elias's mouth. "Water rights? Something about old claims through the bride's family, from what I gathered. Didn't make much sense to me, but he was real pleased with himself." Jake shrugged. Breaking off a piece of cornbread, Elias pushed his plate away, appetite gone. "That doesn't sound right. The only old water claims around here belong to the Navajo families who were forced out. Like your friend's family?" Jake asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Elias stood abruptly, needing space to think. "I'll check the horses before turning in." Outside, the night had settled fully over the ranch. Stars pricked the dark sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Elias leaned against the corral fence, its rough wood familiar under his hands. Clara's words echoed in his mind. His friendship meant a great deal during difficult times. He remembered those days clearly now, the young girl with long dark braids who sat next to him in the one-room schoolhouse, who shared her mother's fry bread at lunch, who never cried when the other children were cruel, but whose eyes shone with gratitude when he stood beside her. He had missed her when her family disappeared, had wondered over the years what had become of them all, and now here she was, grown into a woman of quiet grace, about to marry Charles Redmond. The banker's earlier expression, that flash of displeasure. The possessive grip on Clara's arm stirred something protective in Elias's chest. For the first time since Sarah's passing, he felt his heart warming with purpose, with hope, yet Jake's words about water rights nagged at him. He knew how valuable water access was in these parts, how many families had suffered when their claims were disputed or denied. The idea of Clara being used as a means to secure such rights made his stomach turn. The night air grew cooler, carrying the scent of sage and dust. In the barn, a horse nickered softly. Elias straightened, running a hand over his face. 3 years he'd spent in a fog of grief, going through the motions of living without really engaging with the world around him. Now, with Clara's unexpected return, he felt truly awake again, and with that awakening came not just hope, but worry. What was really behind this marriage arrangement? Why had Clara seemed to be reaching out to him, even as her future husband tried to hurry her away? The questions circled in his mind like autumn leaves in a wind, refusing to settle. A lantern's glow spilled from the kitchen window, where Jake was likely finishing up the dishes. The simple domestic sight reminded Elias of earlier, happier times. He'd known contentment once with Sarah. The thought of Clara potentially trapped in an unhappy arrangement, being used for her family's old claims, sat wrong in his heart. Standing there in the deepening night, Elias realized that the peace he'd found in his solitude these past years was ending. Clara's return had stirred something in him, not just the warmth of remembered friendship or the first flickering of new feelings, but a growing certainty that something wasn't right about her situation. The hope that had bloomed at seeing her again was now tangled with unease. Like morning glory vines wrapped around a fence post, the morning sun painted long shadows across the rutted street as Elias guided his horse into town. Dawn's amber light caught the frost still clinging to fence posts and water troughs. His breath fogged in the crisp air while hoofbeats echoed against the silent buildings. The blacksmith's forge already glowed orange, sending sparks dancing into the early light. As Elias dismounted near the hitching post, familiar voices carried from inside the shop. He recognized Charles Redmond's cultured tone, followed by Josh Miller's deeper laugh. Smart business. Tying up water and grazing rights through a woman's hand, Miller was saying. Especially with that southern grazing land her family still holds claim to. Indeed, Charles's laugh held no warmth. Why wage legal battles when a simple marriage contract will do? Though I must say, playing the gracious protector to her reservation kin grows tiresome. Elias's hands clenched into fists, rage prickling hot in his chest. The leather of his reins creaked as his grip tightened. Every instinct urged him to storm into the shop and confront the banker's casual cruelty. Instead, he forced himself to breathe slowly, loosening his white-knuckled grip. Direct confrontation would only make things worse for Clara. He led his horse toward the mercantile, mind churning over Charles's words. The morning air had lost its crispness, turning heavy with his troubled thoughts. As he secured his mount, movement caught his eye. Clara emerged from the boarding house across the street, her dark hair neat under a modest bonnet. She spotted him immediately, glancing both ways before crossing to meet him. Her simple calico dress whispered against the wooden sidewalk as she approached. "Good morning, Mr. Harding," she said formally, conscious of the few early risers starting their day nearby. "Might I have a word?" Elias nodded, removing his hat. "Of course, Miss Yazzie." They fell into step together, moving away from the main street toward the narrow alley behind the mercantile. The morning shadows still held here, offering privacy from prying eyes. Stacked crates and barrels lined the weathered back wall of the store. Clara's shoulders dropped slightly once they were hidden from view, some of her careful composure falling away. She turned to face him, worry evident in her dark eyes. "I must explain about Charles," she began softly. "This engagement, it isn't what people think. I never wished to wed him." Elias remained silent, giving her space to continue. A gentle breeze stirred loose strands of her hair, carrying the scent of sage from the distant hills. "My brother Thomas is still on the reservation," Clara went on, her voice barely above a whisper. Conditions there grow worse each season. Less water, poor soil, broken promises from the Indian agent. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill despite the warming day. Charles offered protection for Thomas, promised to use his influence to ensure my brother's safety and comfort. All he asked was my hand in marriage. Clara Elias's voice was rough with emotion. That's not protection, it's exploitation. She shook her head quickly. What choice did I have? Thomas is all the family I have left. He's so young, so angry at the injustice of it all. I fear what might happen if he acts on that anger without someone to shield him. Her eyes met Elias's, fierce with determination. I would sacrifice anything to keep him safe. Admiration for her courage warred with anger in Elias's chest, not at her, but at the impossible choice forced upon her. The burden she carried alone was too heavy for any soul to bear. Besides, she added with a ghost of her old smile, Charles's interest lies more in our family's water rights than in me. The marriage contract would give him control of the spring-fed grazing, land that still belongs to us through the old treaties. Elias's jaw tightened as Charles's earlier words echoed in his mind. I heard him this morning, bragging about securing water rights through marriage. Pain flickered across Clara's face before she masked it. Then you understand why I agreed. The rights to that water are all Thomas and I have left of our father's legacy. At least this way, I can ensure my brother's protection in exchange. She laid her hand on Elias's arm, a touch light but speaking volumes. Please, you must keep this conversation between us. If Charles suspects I've spoken of this, I'll not breathe a word, Elias promised. The warmth of her hand seemed to reach straight to his heart, awakening feelings he'd thought long buried with his wife's passing. For a moment, they stood in shared silence. The years fell away, and Elias remembered the brave girl who'd shared her cornbread with him at lunch, who'd taught him Navajo words behind the schoolhouse, who'd vanished one day without warning when her family was forced onto the reservation. Now here she stood again, that same quiet strength in her eyes, though shadowed by heavier burdens. Joy and dread tangled in his chest. Joy at finding her again, at feeling his heart stirred to life after so long. But dread, too, knowing the danger she faced, trapped in Charles's scheme. Her heart wasn't free to follow its own path, and neither, he realized with growing certainty, was his. The sound of approaching wagon wheels broke the moment. Clara stepped back, smoothing her skirts with practiced composure. "Thank you for listening, Elias," she said softly. Then she slipped away, leaving him alone in the alley with his troubled thoughts. The morning sun had climbed higher now, earning away the last shadows. But Elias stood motionless, feeling the phantom warmth of Clara's touch on his arm, knowing with growing certainty that he could not stand idle while Charles Redmond used her. Devotion to her brother as a weapon against her. The evening air carried the sweet sounds of hymns through the church's open windows. Oil lamps cast a warm glow across the wooden pews where townsfolk gathered, their voices rising and falling in familiar melodies. Elias sat in the back row, his hat resting on his knee. Watching Clara's profile in the flickering light, she sang softly, her voice barely audible above the congregation. But Elias could see her lips moving to the well-worn words of Amazing Grace. Charles Redmond sat beside her, his posture straight and proud, occasionally glancing around the church as if to ensure everyone noticed his position next to his beautiful bride-2-B. The piano's notes, played by Mrs. Henderson's practiced hands, filled the simple space. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, and the scent of late summer flowers decorated the altar. Pastor Josiah Bennett stood at the front, leading the congregation with his rich baritone. His weathered Bible open before him. "Let us sing Rock of Ages," Pastor Josiah announced, turning the pages of the worn hymnal. The congregation rustled as they found the correct page. Elias couldn't focus on the words. His gaze kept drifting to Clara, noting how her shoulders tensed whenever Charles leaned close to whisper something in her ear. The banker's proprietary smile made Elias's jaw clench as the final notes of the evening faded. Pastor Josiah offered a closing prayer. People began to rise, gathering their things and chatting in low voices. Charles immediately engaged himself in conversation with the town council members. Leaving Clara momentarily alone, Pastor Josiah made his way through the crowd, stopping to speak with various members of his flock. When he reached the back of the church where Elias lingered, his eyes crinkled with warmth. "Elias Harding," he said, clasping Elias's hand. "Good to see you here tonight." He turned as Clara approached, her shawl drawn close against the evening chill. "And Miss Clara Yazzie. My. Seems like yesterday you two were causing trouble in the schoolhouse." Clara's eyes brightened with memory. "You taught us both, Pastor Bennett." "That I did." The pastor nodded, his voice softening. "I remember a certain young man who stood up for a little girl when others weren't so kind." He looked between them meaningfully. "The Lord's justice moves in its own time, children. Trust in His wisdom." Elias saw understanding in Clara's eyes, matching his own. The pastor hadn't forgotten those schoolyard days. Nor had he missed the undercurrent of tension in the present situation. "Miss Yazzie," Elias said carefully, aware of curious eyes around them, "might I escort you to the boarding house?" The evening's growing dark. Before Clara could respond, Charles's voice cut through the air. "My dear, the Hendersons have invited us to take tea." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were cold as they fixed on Elias. "I'm rather tired," Clara said quietly. "I think I'll retire for the evening." Charles's jaw tightened, but he couldn't object without appearing controlling in front of the lingering congregation. "Very well. Mr. Harding can see you to the door, I suppose." They walked in silence through the deepening twilight. Crickets chirped in the tall grass beside the Packtreth street, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. When they were far enough from the church, Clara spoke barely above a whisper. "I pray every night for guidance," she confessed. Her words meant only for Eliza's ears. "For some way out of this trap I've made for myself. But Thomas, double quotes," she trailed off, her voice catching. "Your brother's safety matters more than your own happiness," Elias finished for her, understanding all too well the weight of family duty. Yes, Clara's single word carried years of burden. Charles knows exactly how to use that. He speaks of protection and opportunity. T's words are chains. Elias wanted to reach for her hand, to offer some tangible comfort, but he kept his distance. "You're not alone," he said. Instead, his voice low and fierce. "Whatever comes, remember that." They approached the boarding house steps, its windows warm with lamplight. Before Clara could respond, a shadow detached itself from the porch. Charles, his face hard in the dim light. "I thought I might find you here," he said smoothly. But danger lurked beneath his polished words. "Mr. Harding, while I appreciate your ... courtesy ... I must ask you to keep your distance from my fiancé." Elias felt his muscles coil with tension. He wanted nothing more than to confront the banker, to expose his manipulation and cruelty. But such action would only bring consequences down on Clara and her brother. "Good evening, Mr. Redmond," he said evenly, touching the brim of his hat. "Miss Yazzie." He turned and walked away. Each step an exercise in restraint. The ride home seemed longer than usual, the stars cold and distant overhead. Eliza's ranch house stood dark and silent, save for the low whicker of horses in the barn. He lit a single candle in the kitchen, its flame casting more shadows than light. Sitting at the scarred wooden table, Elias stared into the flickering light. His thoughts circled like moths around that flame, Clara's quiet strength. Her brother Thomas trapped on the reservation. Charles's smug certainty of victory. The banker wielded power like a weapon, using Thomas's vulnerability to force Clara's compliance. The candle guttered in a draft, throwing strange shadows on the walls. Elias remembered Clara's voice, singing hymns, so soft yet unbroken. He thought of her brother, a boy he'd never met, held hostage by Charles's false promises of protection. His heart ached for them both. Clara's sacrifice and Thomas's unknowing part in this cruel game. The night pressed against the windows, vast and empty. Elias's own loneliness, constant companion these past years, felt different now. It was sharpened by purpose, by the need to help someone else carry their burden. He couldn't storm in like some dime novel hero, but he could stand witness. He could let Clara know she wasn't facing this alone. The candle's flame danced, steady and true, as Elias sat in his quiet kitchen, his mind full of prayers and possibilities. Sometimes, he knew, the strongest defiance was simply refusing to look away from injustice. He would watch and wait, and be ready when the moment came to act. Dust spiraled behind Elias's horse as he rode toward the reservation agency. The morning sun already baking the desert earth. The weathered building stood alone against the vast sky, its wood siding bleached gray from years of harsh weather. A tired American flag hung limp above the entrance. Inside, the Indian agent slouched at his desk, papers scattered across the surface. The man looked up with weary eyes as Elias's boots creaked on the wooden floor. "Looking for information about Thomas Yazzie," Elias said, removing his hat. "Young man probably left the reservation recently." The agent rubbed his face. "Can't keep track of all of them? Rations got cut again last month, flour and beans down by half. Young men, they drift off, try to find work." He shuffled through some papers without real interest. Can't blame them. Nothing here but dust and empty bellies. Elise's jaw tightened. Any idea where Thomas Matov gone? Could be anywhere. Mining camps up north, railroad gangs headed west. The agent shrugged. "Not my problem once they leave." "Much obliged," Elias said stiffly, turning to go. The man's indifference made his stomach turn as he stepped onto the agency's wooden porch. An elderly Navajo man caught his attention. The man's face was deeply lined, his silver hair tied back neatly. He carried himself with quiet dignity despite his worn clothes. "You ask about Thomas," the elder said, his English careful but clear. "Clara's brother." Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." "I'm Elias Harding. I'm called Elder Nez." The old man's dark eyes studied Elias. "I knew their father well. A good man who understood both worlds." He gestured for Elias to follow him into the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Clara's father," Elder Nez continued. "He was wise about water. Filed papers with the territory office, claiming rights to the creek that crossed their land. His weathered hands sketched the creek's path in the air. Before the soldiers came, before they moved us here." Hope stirred in Elias's chest. Those papers, would they still exist? Perhaps. In old records, gathering dust, Elder Nez's expression grew serious. "Charles Redmond, he thinks to own all water rights through marriage. But water belongs to the land, and the land remembers its true people." "Thank you," Elias said, with genuine respect. "You've given me something to work with." The elder touched Elias's arm. "Clara carries her father's strength. She needs friends with honest hearts." The ride back to town gave Elias time to think. If Clara's father had filed a legal water claim, it might protect her from Charles's schemes. The territorial office would have records, but searching through years of dusty papers would take time. Time Clara didn't have. The sun was setting when he reached town, painting the buildings in deep gold. Most businesses were closed, but lamplight glowed in a few windows. Elias tied his horse outside the church where he'd arranged to meet Clara. The small church stood dark and quiet. Elias slipped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. A match flared as Clara lit a single lamp, her face emerging from the shadows. She wore a simple dress today, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I can only stay a little while," she whispered. "Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house thinks I'm writing letters in my room." They sat in a back pew, the lamp casting just enough light to see each other's faces. For a moment, neither spoke, remembering other times they'd sat here as children during Sunday school. "Do you remember," Clara said softly, "how we used to play by the creek? Building dams with stones, floating leaf boats, racing stick boats under the bridge." Elias smiled. "You always won because you knew the fastest currents." Clara laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to chase away the shadows. "Father taught me to read the water, how it moves, where it gathers strength." Her laughter faded. "He taught me so much about living in both worlds." "I met Elder Nas at the agency today," Elias said. "He remembered your father. Said he filed water rights claims before everything changed." Clara's eyes widened. "I was so young when we left. I remember papers, Father being very careful with them. But then the soldiers came, and we had to go quickly." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Charles never mentioned any old claims, because he likely doesn't know." Elias kept his voice low. "Those papers could change everything, Clara. It doesn't matter now." Her voice caught. "Charles plans to announce the wedding date tomorrow. He wants it done within the week." She stood abruptly, pacing before the first pew. "He says Thomas needs protection. That trouble could find him so easily out there alone." "We'll find Thomas," Elias promised. "And those papers." "Clara, don't give up hope." She turned to him, lamplight catching the tears in her eyes. "I'd forgotten what hope felt like, Elias. All these years. Just surviving day to day." She touched his hand briefly. "Thank you for remembering me, for being the same good-hearted boy who stood up to bullies in the schoolyard. And you're still the brave girl who never backed down," Elias said softly. "We'll find a way through this." Together, a floorboard creaked near the door. Clara quickly stepped back, straightening her shawl. "I have to go. Mrs. Peterson will be checking rooms soon." She moved toward the side door, then paused. "Be careful, Elias. Charles has friends in high places." After she left, Elias remained in the lamplight, remembering the sound of her laughter, the first real joy he'd heard from her since her return. It stirred something in his heart he'd thought long buried. But Clara was right. Time was short, and Charles Redmond was a dangerous man to cross. Tomorrow, he would begin searching for those water claim papers. They were out there somewhere, gathering dust in territorial records. For Clara's sake, for the memory of her father's foresight. He had to find them before Charles forced her into a loveless marriage built on greed and manipulation. The lamp flickered low as Elias finally stood to leave. Outside, the stars spread across the dark sky like scattered diamonds, unchanged from when he and Clara had been children sharing dreams of their future. He offered a quiet prayer that those dreams might yet have a chance to bloom. Dawn painted the sky in soft brushstrokes of pink and gold as Elias tied his horse. Outside the county clerk's office, the morning air still held its crisp bite, and his boots echoed on the wooden sidewalk. He'd arrived early, hoping to search through the records before most of the town stirred to life. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over the cramped space. Behind a tall desk, the clerk, Mr. Jenkins, dozed in his chair, spectacles perched precariously on his nose. The man startled awake at the sound of Elias's entrance. "Lord above, Mr. Harding." Jenkins straightened his vest. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Need to look through some old water rights documents," Elias said, keeping his voice low. "From about 20 years back, if you've got them." Jenkins scratched his chin. 20 years. Thos'll be in the back room, gathering dust with the rest of the territory's history. He lifted a ring of keys from his desk. Any particular claim you're seeking? Yazzie family deed. Near the creek that runs through my ranch. The clerk's eyebrows rose. But he said nothing, simply motioning Elias to follow. They entered a small room lined with shelves of leather-bound books and stacks of yellowing papers. The musty smell of old documents filled the air. Let's see here, Jenkins ran his finger along the spines of several volumes. Land claims from that period would be ... Double quotes, he pulled out a heavy book, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Here, somewhere. For the next hour, they pored over brittle pages and faded ink. Elias's heart sank with each fruitless search until Jenkins made a small sound of discovery. Well now, what's this? The clerk carefully extracted a folded document from between 2 pages. Yazzie, that's the name you wanted? Elias's pulse quickened as he took the paper. The document was yellowed with age, but the writing remained clear enough to read. His eyes moved rapidly over the formal language, and then he saw it, the proof they needed. The deed showed clear ownership of water rights along Eagle Creek, granted to Joseph Yazzie, Clara's father. The claim predated all others in the area, including those Charles Redmond now sought to control. This is it, Elias breathed, hope surging through him. Would you make a copy, Mr. Jenkins? Need to keep this official. The clerk nodded, already reaching for fresh paper and ink. Might take a spell to get it all down proper. While Jenkins worked, Elias studied the original document. The creek named in the deed meandered through both the reservation lands and his own ranch before joining the larger river. It was the very water Charles aimed to control through his marriage to Clara. With the copy secured in his vest pocket, Elias hurried to the mercantile. The morning sun now streamed bright through the dusty windows as he entered the store. Clara stood near the fabric counter, examining a bolt of calico. Her eyes met his, reading the urgency in his expression. They moved to a quiet corner behind the seed displays, where barrels of grain offered some privacy. Elias carefully withdrew the copied deed. Look here, he whispered, unfolding the paper. Your father's water claim, Clara? It's legal and binding. Filed 20 years ago with the territory. Clara's hands trembled as she took the document. I remember him speaking of this, but we thought all such papers were lost when ... her voice caught. When we were moved to the reservation, this proves the water rights belong to your family, Elias said softly. Not Charles, no matter what he claims. Hope bloomed in Clara's dark eyes. Then I needn't marry him. The creek would still be ours. The law's clear on this. We should take it to Pastor Bennett. He's respected in town. And he'll know how to proceed proper-like. Clara pressed the paper to her heart, tears gathering in her eyes. God's mercy, she whispered. I never thought... A floorboard creaked behind them. They turned to find Charles Redmond standing at the end of the aisle, his face darkening as he took in their close stance and Clara's emotional state. His eyes fixed on the paper in her hands. My dear, he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge beneath its smooth surface. What brings you to this? Intimate corner of the store. Clara quickly folded the document, tucking it into her skirt pocket. Simply discussing the wedding preparations, Mr. Redmond. Charles's gaze shifted to Elias, suspicious and cold. Indeed. And what interest would Mr. Harding have in our wedding plans? Just being neighborly, Elias replied evenly, though his heart pounded. Good day to you both. He tipped his hat and walked out, feeling Charles's stare boring into his back. The morning's triumph now mingled with concern. They would need to move carefully. The day stretched long as Elias tended to his ranch duties, his mind never far from the morning's discovery. As evening approached, he drove his cattle toward the home pasture. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant orange, casting long shadows across the grass. Leading his horse to the barn, Elias paused to watch the magnificent sunset. The beauty of it caught in his throat. How long had it been since he'd truly noticed such things? Since his wife's passing, he'd moved through his days like a man half asleep, until Clara's return stirred him back to life. In the quiet of twilight, as he filled the water troughs and checked the barn doors, Elias allowed himself a moment of dreaming. He imagined Clara free from Charles's manipulation, her brother Thomas safe, their family's rights restored. And perhaps, in time, they might build something together. He and Clara, something born of their shared past and growing feelings. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, watching the last rays of sun gild the distant mountains, "for showing us the way." But even as gratitude filled his heart, he knew tomorrow would bring its own battles. Charles Redmond was not a man to lose gracefully, and the path ahead would require all their courage and faith to navigate. Night had settled over the town like a heavy blanket when the first shouts pierced the darkness. Elias jolted awake in his chair by the dying fire, his Bible still open on his lap. More voices erupted, followed by the thunder of hooves on packed earth. His heart hammering. He grabbed his coat and rushed outside. Lantern light bobbed through the pre-dawn gloom as a group of riders approached the jail. Through the murky darkness, Elias made out Deputy Morris dragging a struggling figure in chains. The prisoner stumbled and fell hard in the dirt. When the deputy yanked him up by the collar, lamplight revealed Thomas Yazzy's bloodied face. "Get up, horse thief." Deputy Morris spat, giving Thomas another rough shake. Elias's blood ran cold. He knew Thomas the boy was many things, but no thief. This reeked of Charles Redmond's scheming. He hurried toward the jail just as Clara's anguished cry split the air. "Thomas, what have they done to you?" She ran to her brother, but Deputy Morris shoved her back. Thomas tried to speak through swollen lips, but the deputy cuffed him hard across the face. "Leave him be." Elias stepped between them, his voice sharp as a blade. "Sheriff Holt needs to hear this proper-like." The commotion had drawn others from their beds. Lanterns flickered to life in nearby windows as Sheriff Holt appeared, hastily buttoning his vest. "What's all this ruckus?" "Caught this Indian boy stealing horses from the miller's spread," Deputy Morris declared, shoving Thomas toward the jail door. "Found him red-handed?" "We did." "That's a lie." Clara grabbed the sheriff's arm. "My brother would never steal." "Please, you must believe me." Sheriff Holt's weathered face creased with concern as he studied Thomas's battered condition. "Seems you worked him over pretty good before bringing him in, Morris." The deputy's lip curled. He resisted arrest. "He's innocent," Elias said firmly. "This isn't right, and you know it, Sheriff." Inside the jail, Thomas swayed on his feet as they locked him in a cell. His left eye was swollen shut, and blood trickled from his split lip. Clara pressed against the barred window, reaching through to touch his hand. She, sister, Thomas, whispered in Navajo. "I did nothing wrong. They came for me in the night." Sheriff Holt pulled Elias aside while Deputy Morris strutted out, spurs jingling. "Look here, Harding. I don't like this business any more than you do. But Morris claims he has 2 witnesses who saw the boy with Miller's horses, bought witnesses." "More likely," Elias growled. "This has Charles Redmond's stink all over it." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Maybe so. But without proof, my hands are tied. The boy stays locked up until trial." Dawn was breaking when Clara finally turned from the window. Her face tear-streaked, but composed. "I must speak with Charles." "Clara, wait." Elias reached for her, but she pulled away. "No, Elias, I know what I must do." Her voice quavered. "If marrying him is the price of Thomas's freedom, then so be it." "You can't trust him," Elias protested. "Once he has you, there's no guarantee he'll help Thomas." What choice do I have? Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. They'll hang him for horse theft. You know they will. Elise's chest tightened with helpless rage. She was right, horse theft often meant the gallows, especially for a Native American accused by white men. The water rights proof they'd found seemed hollow now against the immediate threat to Thomas's life. I won't interfere, he said finally, each word like acid in his mouth. But give me time to find another way. Clara touched his arm briefly, her eyes full of sorrow. There is no time, my friend. The wedding is in 3 days. She hurried away toward the banker's house as the sun crested the hills. Elias watched her go, his fists clenched at his sides. He had never felt so useless, so utterly defeated. The ride home seemed endless. His ranch house stood empty and dark against the morning sky, mocking him with its silence. Inside, he slumped into his chair by the cold hearth. Every shadow in the room as heavy as lead. Lord, he whispered hoarsely, I need your wisdom. Show me how to help them. His only answer was the lonely howl of coyotes echoing across the dark hills. Elias bowed his head, his hands knotted together so tight his knuckles showed white. Somewhere in town, Thomas lay bleeding in a cell while Clara prepared to sacrifice herself to a snake-like. Charles Redmond. The coyotes called again, their eerie chorus drifting through the valley like lost souls. Elias had never felt more alone, more desperate for divine guidance. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, something deep in his spirit refused to surrender. There had to be a way to expose Charles's scheme and save both Clara and Thomas. He just had to find it. He opened his Bible again, letting it fall where it would. His eyes fell on words that seemed to burn off the page. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest. Nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Elias traced the verse with his finger. Hope flickering faintly in his chest. Perhaps the Lord was telling him to dig deeper, to search harder for the truth that would set them free. Charles Redmond might think he held all the cards. But Elias knew better than to underestimate the power of prayer and persistence. The darkness pressed close around him as he sat vigil through the remaining hours before dawn. Every creak of the house, every distant coyote cry, seemed to mock his helplessness. Yet still he prayed, his fists clenched against despair, trusting that even in this darkest hour, God had not abandoned them. Morning sunlight spilled across the town's dusty main street, painting the weathered buildings in shades of gold. Inside the boarding house's best room, Clara Yazzie stood motionless before a spotted mirror as townswomen fussed with her wedding gown. The white fabric felt heavy on her shoulders, like chains instead of celebration. Such a lovely bride, Mrs. Peterson murmured, adjusting the lace at Clara's throat. Though it's curious how quick this wedding came about. Clara kept her eyes fixed on her reflection, seeing not herself but Thomas's bruised face through the jail cell bars. The thought of her brother suffering while she stood here in silk made her stomach turn. Still, she held herself tall, the way her father had taught her. Dignity, even in darkness. Here now, dear, Mrs. Wilson said, lifting the veil. Every bride should look like an angel on her special day. The older woman's words were kind, but her eyes held questions she didn't dare voice. The fine mesh settled over Clara's face, and she was grateful for its shelter. At least now the women couldn't see the tears that threatened to spill. Their busy hands smoothed and straightened, their whispered conversations swirling around her like autumn leaves. Did you hear about her brother? In jail for horse thieving, they say, and her being half Indian. Though she carries herself well enough, Charles Redmond must see something special in her. Rushing to the altar this way, Clara's fingers curled into fists beneath her sleeves. If they only knew the truth, that this marriage was built on threats and fear, not love. But she would endure it, just as she had endured everything else. For Thomas? Always for Thomas. Across town, Elias Harding stood in his barn's cool shadows, each movement slow and heavy as he saddled his horse. The church bells began their solemn toll, the sound carrying clear across the morning air. 8 chimes. 1 hour until the ceremony. His horse nickered softly, sensing his distress. "I know, old friend," he murmured, running a hand down the animal's neck. "Ain't right, none of it." The morning sun streamed through the barn slats, catching dust motes in golden bars. It should have been beautiful, but everything felt wrong today. He thought of the water deed hidden safe in his vest pocket. The proof that could free Clara's people from Charles's scheming, but not soon enough to save Thomas from false imprisonment. His jaw clenched. The banker had played his hand well, using Clara's love for her brother to force her down the aisle. Elias mounted up, his movements mechanical. The ride into town felt like the longest of his life. Each hoofbeat matched the heavy rhythm of his heart. Other townsfolk were already making their way to the church, dressed in their Sunday best, eager for the spectacle of Charles Redmond's wedding. He tied his horse at the hitching post near the church steps, removing his hat as he took his place among the gathering crowd. The morning air was warming, but Elias felt cold inside. A murmur rippled through the onlookers as Clara emerged from the boarding house. She moved like a ghost through the morning light, her white dress catching the sun. Townsfolk lined the street, some nodding respectfully, others whispering behind raised hands. Clara kept her head high beneath the veil, each step measured and graceful despite the weight of her sacrifice. Elias's heart clenched as she drew closer. Through the delicate mesh of her veil, he could see her face, composed but pale as milk. She was the bravest person he'd ever known, walking toward her own imprisonment to save another. The sight of her brought back memories of schoolyard days, when she'd faced down bullies with that same quiet strength. Just before the church steps, Clara paused. Her head turned slightly, and through the veil, their eyes met. In that brief moment, Elias saw everything: her fear, her resignation, and something else that made his chest ache. Then she looked away, ascending the worn wooden steps with careful dignity. The heavy church door creaked open, swallowing her in its shadows. Elias turned away, his fingers white-knuckled around his hat brim. The crowd began filing in behind her, their excited chatter a stark contrast to the funeral march this felt like. He couldn't bear to follow, couldn't watch Clara bind herself to a man who saw her only as a means to steal her people's water. Right. The morning sun continued to climb, warming his shoulders, but Elias felt no heat. He stared unseeing at the dusty street, his mind full of Clara's veiled face, Thomas's cell, and the water deed that came too late to prevent this travesty. The church bells tolled their final notes, calling everyone to witness what should have been a celebration, but felt more like an execution around him. The last stragglers hurried inside, not wanting to miss a moment of the spectacle. Their boots thumped against the wooden steps, the sound like dirt falling on a coffin lid. Elias remained rooted by the hitching post, his heart as heavy as the mountains on the horizon dawn inside. The organ began to play, its notes drifting out into the morning air. Each measure of the wedding march felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He thought of Clara walking down that aisle, sacrificing her freedom for her brother's safety. The same brother who had been unjustly imprisoned by the very man she was about to marry. The music swelled, and Elias's hands trembled. Every fiber of his being wanted to burst through those church doors and stop this mockery of a marriage. But he knew he couldn't, not without condemning Thomas to a fate worse than jail. Charles Redmond had made sure of that. Using the corrupt deputy to weave his web of false accusations, the sound of horses approaching drew his attention. 2 ranch hands rode past, late for the ceremony, their curiosity evident as they dismounted and hurried inside. The church door opened and closed one final time, leaving Elias alone in the morning sunshine with his helplessness and heartache. He lifted his eyes to the clear blue sky, seeking answers in its vast expanse. The same sky that had watched over Clara's people for generations. The same sky that had witnessed countless injustices on this frontier. Now it would witness one more, and he was powerless to prevent it. His horse shifted restlessly, sensing his distress. Elias reached out to stroke its neck, finding small comfort in the familiar warmth. The organ music continued to drift out from the church, marking each moment that brought Clara closer to her fate. Each note seemed to echo the words she had spoken to him in confidence about sacrifice, about duty to family, about dreams deferred. The town around him carried on its morning business, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding within the church walls. The general store owner swept his porch, a freight wagon rumbled past, and somewhere a dog barked at a passing cat. Life continued its steady march forward, even as Elias felt stuck in this moment of profound loss. Inside the whitewashed church, morning light filtered through plain glass windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Clara knelt alone at the simple altar, her white gown pooling around her like spilled milk. Her fingers twisted together as she bowed her head, lips moving in silent, desperate prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely stirring the still air, "if there be any way, any path but this." ... Double quotes, her shoulders trembled beneath the delicate veil. Pastor Josiah emerged from the small vestry, his weathered Bible tucked under one arm. He paused, watching Clara's solitary vigil with concern etched across his kind face. The sight of her trembling form brought to mind another young woman who'd knelt there years ago, Elias's first wife, full of joy and hope. This scene before him now bore no resemblance to that happy day. "Child," he said softly, approaching the altar rail, "are you certain your heart is at peace with this path?" Clara lifted her head, tears glinting beneath her veil. "I must think of Thomas," she whispered. "What choice do I have?" The pastor settled beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you trust that the Lord has a plan, even when the way seems dark?" "I'm trying," Clara admitted, her voice catching. "But it's so hard to see his hand in this." Outside in the dusty street, Elias Harding stood with his back against a hitching post, unable to tear his gaze from the church's white-painted door. His Sunday best felt too tight around his throat, though he hadn't bothered with a tie. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, but he barely noticed the heat. Each toll of the church bell struck his heart like a hammer blow. A sound caught his attention, hoofbeats approaching fast from the east end of town. Elias straightened, squinting against the morning glare. A cloud of dust rose against the blue sky, and from it emerged a familiar figure on horseback, Elder Naz, riding hard despite his years, his silver hair streaming behind him. The old man reined in sharply, his horse's hooves skidding in the dirt. In his hand he clutched what looked like official papers, the seal of the territory clearly visible even from where Elias stood. "Mr. Harding." Elder Nez called out, his usually measured voice urgent. "The proof we have it at last." He dismounted with surprising agility, his eyes bright with triumph. "Charles Redmond's corruption is exposed. Here are documents showing he bribed the deputy to fabricate charges against young Thomas." Elias's heart leaped into his throat. "You're certain?" he demanded. Striding forward to examine the papers Elder Nez thrust toward him. "These are signed statements from 2 witnesses who saw the deputy accept payment," Elder Nez explained quickly. "And here, proof that Thomas was working at the Williams Ranch the very day he was accused of stealing horses." The deputy knew this when he arrested him. Hope roared through Elias's chest like a prairie fire. "The sheriff," he said. "We need to show this to Sheriff Holt right now." Together, they hurried toward the sheriff's office, their boots raising small puffs of dust. They found Sheriff Holt at his desk, already dressed in his best jacket for the wedding. His eyes narrowed as they burst in, but widened again as Elder Nez spread the documents before him. "By heaven," the sheriff muttered, scanning the papers. His weathered face darkened as he read. "This deputy's been nothing but trouble since he came to town. But this, .. He looked up, jaw set. "This demands immediate action." The sheriff stood, buckling on his gun belt with decisive movements. "Stop those wedding bells," he ordered, striding toward the door. "This ceremony ain't proceeding under false pretenses." Elias followed, Hope making his steps light for the first time in days. The sheriff's authoritative shout carried across the street, and the church bells stuttered to silence mid-tall. The sudden quiet felt electric, full of possibility, as they approached the church steps. Elias caught sight of Charles Redmond emerging from the mercantile in his fine wedding suit, his face darkening at the unexpected interruption. The banker started forward, but the sheriff's raised hand stopped him cold. "Hold right there." "Mr. Redmond," Sheriff Holt called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We've got some matters to discuss before any vows are exchanged." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the drama unfolding before the church. Elias's heart pounded as he followed the sheriff up the steps, knowing that behind those white doors Clara waited, and that perhaps, at last, deliverance had arrived just in time. Inside the church, Pastor Josiah and Clara both looked up at the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor. The sheriff's face was stern as he strode down the aisle, followed by Elias and Elder Naz. Clara rose from her knees, hope and fear warring in her expression as she saw the papers in their hands. "Miss Yazzie," the sheriff said formally, "I believe you'll want to hear what Elder Naz has discovered about your brother's arrest." A small gasp escaped Clara's lips as she reached for the documents with trembling fingers. Pastor Josiah stepped closer, lending his steady presence as she read, his own eyes widening at the evidence of corruption laid bare. Through the open church door, they could all hear Charles Redmond's angry protests from the street below. But here, in this sacred space, truth was finally breaking free like sunshine after a storm. Elias watched Clara's face as understanding dawned, saw the moment when the weight of forced sacrifice lifted from her shoulders, and felt his own heart soar with renewed purpose and joy. The heavy church doors burst open with a thunderous crack. Sheriff Holt's boots echoed against the floorboards as he strode down the center aisle, Spage catching the morning light. Pastor Josiah paused mid-sentence, his worn Bible still open in his weathered hands. The congregation twisted in their seats, necks craning to watch the lawman's determined approach. "This wedding cannot proceed," Sheriff Holt announced, his voice filling every corner of the small church. He held up a stack of papers, the edges crinkled and yellow with age. "We have proof that Mr. Charles Redmond falsified charges against Thomas Yazzie." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Women clutched their hands to their throats while men shifted uncomfortably in their Sunday suits. Charles stood rigid at the altar, his face flushing crimson beneath his perfectly trimmed mustache. "That's preposterous," Charles sputtered, adjusting his silk tie with trembling fingers. "Who would dare make such accusations?" Elder Nez from the reservation brought sworn statements. The sheriff continued, unfolding the documents. "Along with evidence that you forged complaints against Thomas to force this marriage." He turned to face the congregation. "The deputy involved has already confessed to the scheme." Clara's hands flew to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. In one swift motion, she ripped back her veil, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded web. Her dark eyes blazed with a mix of relief and righteous anger. "I will not marry you, Charles Redmond," she declared, her voice strong and clear. The words seemed to lift a great weight from her shoulders. "You used my brother's safety to trap me. But your lies have come to light." Charles lunged forward, reaching for Clara's arm. "You cannot, deputies," Sheriff Holt barked, Take him into custody." Two deputies emerged from the church entrance, their spurs jingling against the wooden floors. They moved swiftly to Charles's side, grasping his arms as he tried to twist away. "This is absurd. I am a respected businessman." Charles's polished manner cracked completely, revealing the desperation beneath. "You cannot believe the word of some Indian over mine." His words hung in the air like poison. Several townspeople who had once curried his favor now turned their backs, shaking their heads in disgust. Mrs. Peterson, the milliner's wife, stood up from her pew and walked out, her skirts swishing in disapproval. Others followed, unable to bear the sight of their formerly respected banker revealed as a fraud. "The law believes evidence," Mr. Redmond, Sheriff Holt, said firmly. "And we have plenty of that, including your own handwriting on forged documents." As the deputies led Charles toward the door, he continued to protest, his voice growing more shrill with each step. "Everything I did was legal. Those water rights would have brought prosperity to this town." Pastor Josiah closed his Bible with a gentle thump. "The Lord sees all deception, Mr. Redmond. May He have mercy on your soul." Clara stood straight and proud at the altar, no longer trembling. Her eyes found Elias, who had stepped into the church during the commotion. He moved forward slowly, his weathered hat held respectfully in his hands. The morning light through the windows caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and his eyes held nothing but tenderness. The remaining townspeople watched in hushed wonder as Clara walked down the aisle toward him. Her white dress whispered against the floorboards, but this time her steps were light and free. No longer was she a sacrificial bride, but a woman choosing her own path. "You're truly free now," Elias said softly when she reached him. Clara smiled through her tears. "Free to follow my heart at last." Pastor Josiah approached them, laying a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Your father's water rights and your brother's good name have both been restored." From the back of the church came the sound of running feet. Thomas burst through the doors, no longer in chains, but free, his young face bright with joy. "Clara," he called out, rushing to embrace his sister. Clara caught him in her arms, holding him tight. "Thomas, oh, thank God you're safe." Elder Nez showed them the truth, Thomas explained, pulling back to look at his sister. His eyes widened at her wedding dress. "Did I interrupt something?" A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the remaining congregation. Clara shook her head, smiling. "No, brother. You arrived just in time to see justice done." Sheriff Holt cleared his throat. "Miss Yazzie, we'll need your statement about Redmond's threats and manipulation. But that can wait until tomorrow." He touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "I'm sorry we didn't see through his scheme sooner. What matters is that truth prevailed," Elias said, standing steady beside Clara and Thomas. The morning sun streamed through the windows, painting the church in hope's own light. Clara looked up at him, her face radiant with newfound freedom. Truth, and those who stand by it, no matter the cost. The remaining townspeople began to file out, many stopping to offer Clara their apologies and support. Mrs. Davis, the telegraph operator's wife, pressed Clara's hand warmly. "We should have known better than to believe ill of Thomas. You'll both always have a place here." Through it all, Elias remained at Clara's side, a quiet pillar of strength. When the last of the congregation had gone, leaving only Pastor Josiah and Thomas with them in the sunlit church, Clara finally allowed herself to truly breathe. Her shoulders relaxed, and the last shadows of fear melted from her face. "I feel as though I've been carrying the weight of mountains," she said softly. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," Elias replied, his voice gentle but firm with promise. Thomas looked between them, a knowing smile touching his young face. "I reckon some good came from all this trouble after all." Pastor Josiah chuckled warmly. The Lord has a way of bringing light from darkness and turning sorrow into joy. He gathered his Bible and papers. Now, I believe this family has some catching up to do. Clara stood in the church's doorway, flanked by her brother and Elias, watching the morning sun climb higher over the town. Where once she had seen only walls closing in, now she saw open skies and endless possibility. She was free to reclaim her father's legacy, free to protect her brother, and, most precious of all, free to love where her heart led her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the churchyard as small groups of townspeople lingered, their voices a low murmur against the gentle autumn breeze. Near the weathered wooden bench beneath the oak tree, Clara Yazzie stood with her head held high, her white wedding dress now a symbol not of sacrifice, but of liberation. Beside her, Elias Harding's steady presence anchored their small circle, which included Thomas, newly freed and still bearing the marks of his unjust imprisonment. Pastor Josiah with his kind eyes, and Elder Nez, whose wisdom had helped turn the tide. Elder Nez carefully spread the deed papers across the bench's worn planks, his weathered fingers smoothing the yellowed edges with reverence. The afternoon light illuminated the faded ink, making the truth plain for all to see. The creek rights, documented in careful script, belonged rightfully to the Yazzie family. These papers, Elder Naz explained, his voice carrying the weight of years, show what Clara's father knew to be true. The water flows for all, as the Creator intended. He traced the boundary lines with one finger, showing where the creek wound through both reservation land and Elias's ranch. Thomas stepped closer, his young face solemn as he studied the documents that had cost him days of freedom. "Father always said the water would remember us," he said quietly. "Even when others tried to make us forget." Pastor Josiah nodded, his Bible tucked under one arm. "The Lord's justice flows like a mighty stream," he said, glancing at the small crowd of onlookers. Some townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, while others drew nearer. Drawn by the gravity of the moment, Elias cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the churchyard. Before God and these witnesses, he declared, "I vow to stand with the Yazzie family in protecting these rights." His calloused hand found Clara's, fingers intertwining with gentle strength. "What belongs to your kin will be defended as if it were my own." Clara's fingers trembled in his grasp, but her voice rang clear and true. "Our family's fates have always been tied to this land." "These waters," she said, looking up at Elias with eyes bright with unshed tears. "What was broken in childhood will mend together." From inside the church, the soft notes of amazing grace drifted through the open windows, as if heaven itself was blessing their declaration. The late afternoon sunlight poured across them like honey. Warming the small gathering, Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, stepped forward from the crowd. Her usually stern face softened. "I remember when you two were children," she said, addressing Clara and Elias, always standing up for what was right. Even then, several other townspeople nodded in agreement, though a few still watched with uncertainty in their eyes. Thomas straightened his shoulders, standing taller despite his recent ordeal. "With the deed restored and these rights protected, our people can trust in the water's return," he said. Exchanging a meaningful look with Elder Nez, "The creek feeds both lands," Elder Nez added, his wise eyes moving from face to face. "Like the water itself, we are all connected. This partnership," he gestured to Clara and Elias, "bridges more than just banks of a stream." Pastor Josiah placed one hand on the deed papers, as if blessing them. "Let this be a new chapter for our community," he proclaimed, "where justice flows like water, and righteousness like a never-failing stream." Clara squeezed Elias's hand, their childhood bond transformed into something deeper, stronger. "I never lost faith," she whispered, though her voice carried in the hushed yard. Even in the darkest moments, I knew God had not forgotten us. The hymn from the church swelled, carried on the breeze, was blind. But now I see. The words seemed to touch each person differently. Some bowed their heads. Others stood straighter, while a few dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Elias turned to face Clara fully, his eyes reflecting the same light that had drawn them together as children. "Your father's wisdom will not be forgotten," he promised. "These waters will flow free and fair, as they were meant to." The deed papers rustled gently in the afternoon breeze, secured by Elder Nez's careful hands. The document that had caused so much strife now promised healing, not just for the Yazzie family, but for all who believed in justice's power to restore. Thomas moved to stand beside his sister, his presence completing their circle of trust and determination. The shadows of the oak leaves danced across their faces as the sun continued its westward journey, blessing their gathering with golden light. More townspeople drew closer, their earlier skepticism melting in the face of such clear righteousness. Even old Mr. Harrison, known for his hard views, nodded grudgingly as he studied the deed from a respectful distance. The hymn from within the church faded to a gentle close, leaving a peaceful silence in the churchyard. In that quiet moment, the truth settled over them all, like a healing balm. What had begun as a day of forced unions had transformed into one of willing partnership, of justice restored, of faith rewarded. Clara's hand remained steady now in Elias's grasp, their shared purpose stronger than any paper could document. The water rights were secured, but more than that, they had secured a future where trust could flow as freely as the creek itself. The evening shadows lengthened across Elias's ranch as he led Clara and Thomas up the worn wooden steps of his home. Lamplight spilled from the windows, casting a warm glow that welcomed them inside. His housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, had prepared a hearty supper of beef stew and fresh-baked bread, the aroma filling the cozy kitchen. Around the sturdy oak table, they gathered like a family long separated. Thomas's eyes grew wide at the generous portions, while Clara's smile brightened the room more than any lamp could. Laughter flowed freely between spoonfuls of stew, mingling with tears that none felt ashamed to show. "This tastes like home," Thomas said softly. Breaking off another piece of bread after the meal, Clara wandered through the rooms, her fingers trailing along smooth wooden door frames and well-worn furniture. Each space held a quiet dignity, so different from the stark formality of the boarding house where she'd spent recent weeks. Family photographs and simple decorations spoke of a life lived with purpose and care. "It's nothing fancy," Elias said. Watching her explore, "It's perfect," Clara replied, her voice warm with sincerity as night settled fully over the ranch. Elias and Clara stepped out onto the porch. Above them, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. The familiar sounds of crickets and distant coyotes wrapped around them like an old blanket. Clara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. "My heart has known its path since we were children. Even through all the years apart, it never wavered." Elias's breath caught in his throat. "I carried your memory," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Through war, through loss, through lonely years. You were always there, like a light I couldn't quite reach." They stood close now, their shared history of grief and burden transforming into something new. Hope bloomed between them, as tangible as the night air they breathed. "God's timing is perfect," Clara whispered, her hand finding his. "He brought us back together when we needed each other most." Elias gently squeezed her fingers, feeling the last walls around his heart crumble. Under the vast, starry sky, their souls recognized what they'd always known: they belonged together. Their love as natural as water flowing to the sea. The morning sun painted the church steeple golden as townsfolk gathered for Sunday worship. Word had spread quickly that Charles Redmond was being transported under guard to the county seat. Sheriff Holt stood on the steps, reassuring concerned citizens that justice would be served through proper channels. "The evidence is clear," he explained to the gathered crowd. "The county judge will see that right is done." Inside the church, sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust motes dancing in colored rays from the simple stained glass. Elias guided Clara to a pew near the front, Thomas and Elder Nez following close behind. The wooden boards creaked beneath their feet as they settled in place. Pastor Josiah took his place at the pulpit, his Bible open before him. His voice carried strong and clear through the packed church as he began his sermon on mercy and truth. In these times, he proclaimed, "We are called to choose courage over compromise, to stand firm when evil seeks to prosper through deception." His eyes swept across the congregation. Resting briefly on Clara, "Those who defend the innocent and uphold justice walk in God's light." Clara sat, straight-backed beside Elias, her hands folded quietly in her lap. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and peace seemed to radiate from her very presence. After the final hymn faded away, several townspeople approached Clara. Mrs. Miller, the banker's wife, was first to step forward. "I'm sorry for how we treated you," she said softly, reaching for Clara's hand. "We were wrong to judge without understanding." Others followed the mercantile owner's wife, the schoolteacher, even the blacksmith's gruff old mother. Each offered kind words and gestures of welcome. Small children darted between the pews, tugging at Clara's skirts with innocent affection. "Miss Clara," little Sarah Jenkins called out, "will you teach us to make those pretty beaded flowers?" Clara knelt down, gathering the children close. "Of course I will," she answered, her voice warm with emotion. Elias watched from nearby, his heart full. He bowed his head briefly, offering silent thanks for this transformation. Here was Clara, no longer an outsider, but embraced as neighbor and sister by the very community that had once shunned her. Elder Nez nodded approvingly, his weathered face creased in a gentle smile. Thomas stood tall beside his sister, pride evident in his bearing as he witnessed her acceptance. The morning light continued to pour through the windows, blessing this gathering of hearts made new through understanding and grace. Autumn painted the valley in gold and crimson as wedding preparations quietly took shape. Clara worked on her dress in the evenings, adding subtle Navajo beadwork to simple white cotton. The townswomen brought food and flowers, while Thomas and Elder Nez helped Elias ready the ranch house, expanding it to welcome his new family. As dusk settled over the town one crisp evening, lanterns cast their warm glow through the church windows. Inside, oil lamps lined the walls, their flames dancing on the wooden walls. The pews filled with faces, both familiar and new. Ranchers in their Sunday best, Navajo elders in traditional dress. Children clutching small bouquets of late wildflowers. Pastor Josiah stood at the altar, his Bible open in his weathered hands. Elias waited there too, his usual quiet strength touched with barely contained joy. The first notes of the wedding hymn rose from Mrs. Peterson at the organ, and all heads turned toward the door. Clara appeared in the doorway, radiant in her handmade dress. Thomas stood proud beside his sister, ready to walk her down the aisle. She moved forward with grace, each step taken in freedom and choice so different from the forced march she'd nearly endured weeks before. Her dark eyes shone with happiness as she met Elias's gaze. When they reached the altar, Thomas placed Clara's hand in Elias's with dignity. Before taking his place beside Elder Naz, Pastor Josiah spoke of love's patient strength, of two streams joining to form one river, of God's faithfulness through trials. Elias's voice rang clear and true as he attuned his heart and home to Clara. She responded in kind, her words carrying the weight of hard-won victory and newfound peace. as Pastor Josiah pronounced them husband and wife. The congregation's joy overflowed in happy tears and warm smiles. Outside, the evening air carried the sound of the creek's steady flow, waters now secured for both ranch and reservation. Clara and Elias paused on the church steps, bathed in golden light. She turned to him with a playful smile, whispering, "Do you recognize me?" Elias gathered her close, his eyes full of love. "Always have," he answered softly. The church bells pealed across the valley as townsfolk spilled out around them, cheering and throwing flower petals. Their celebration echoed off the hills, carrying far across the land that had brought them together at last. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.